we're ready.
Yep, that's right. All right, Les, the screen is yours. Thank you very much. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Okay, thank you. And it's good to be here. It's good to hear from, I tried to attend as much of it as I could. A lot of like-minded people, and we need to sing to ourselves and encourage ourselves, because often we get a certain amount of pushback that we're creating mite bombs and all that. And it's nice to hang out with people who get it, who are more tolerant and kind of flexible. I've taught beekeeping for many years. And one thing that happens is that people get on the internet and they start looking at where they can order their first bees or some bees, even if they already have some bees. And they write back to me, or they call me or whatever. Well, what should we do? Which bees should we get? There's Italians, there's Carniolans, there's Russians, there's all these different bees. So it becomes a bit of a dilemma. And of course, everything is connected to everything, and it gets tricky trying to decide. And we're not deciding between species, we're deciding between varieties of the same species. So there is Apis cerana in Asia, and Apis dorsata, the giant honeybee, also in Asia. But we have to deal entirely with the one in the middle, Apis cerana. And then we have a unique situation here in the Americas. For those of us, probably most of us are in the Americas. There were no native honeybees when Christopher Columbus sailed to America. There is a fossil of a honeybee that they found in Nevada. So there apparently were honeybees in the Americas a very long time ago, for 14 million years or whatever. But when the Europeans first came to America, there were no honeybees. And many people say, well, that means that bringing them here was bringing an invasive species. So I one time was involved in a hummingbird study. A man was up in the mountains up above Albuquerque, New Mexico, Sandia Mountains, and he was watching hummingbirds as they migrated in the spring to when right after a flower bloomed called scrophularia, and the hummingbirds would pollinate the scrophularia and go, and they eat a lot of little insects too. I mean, hummingbirds are actually fairly insectivorous. They eat, well, mosquitoes for one, small insects right out of air. But his goal was, he was measuring the nectar in the flowers that the hummingbirds were using with little microtubes. And he wanted me to bring bees up to the area where he was camped out, and get the bees to depress the nectar and see at what level the hummingbirds might leave or be damaged by having the bees in the neighborhood. So I agreed, and this was back in the early 80s. I brought 2 hives. In those days, I was all Langstroth based. We had to hang them from a tree because there's lots of bears up there in that mountain. And the idea was, he paid me $50 a hive for a month. It was going to be for 2 months, $50 a month, which I wouldn't even do anymore. That's way too much work. But it was kind of interesting. I was interested in the project. And instead he called me in 2 weeks and he said, you can come and get your bees. And I said, oh, how come I thought it was going to be up there 2 months. No, it didn't work. I said, what do you mean it didn't work? Well, the hummingbirds are all in the scrophularia. The honeybees don't seem to give any attention on the scrophularia. They're off pollinating the alfalfa and sweet clover on the roadsides and in the disturbed areas. And they're not doing their job. And I said, well, we did learn something. And I'm kind of glad we learned it. And that is that we learned that the hummingbirds and the honeybees are not directly competing for the same nectar source. I said, well, honeybees are an invasive species, and so is the alfalfa and the sweet clover. Then I asked him, what is your family ethnicity? And there was this pause, and then he said, all right, yeah, just coming, you can get the bees whenever you want. So I went and got the bees. The fact is that, talk about invasive species, yes, the intercontinental species transfer can cause problems. We have the Varroa mite was an invasive species. Honeybees could be viewed as an invasive species. A whole lot of the plants that the honeybees are here pollinating were also brought here from Europe, Africa, and Asia. We have a tendency to bring mango trees or fruit trees, most of the fruit being pollinated by honeybees in the United States is also not native to the Americas. Apples, peaches, pears, plums, almonds, etc. There's a whole lot of mixing of the flora and fauna for better or worse, right? The feral pigs are a problem, and they're getting to be more and more of a problem. And I hope we don't have to deal with AAA laps, but here we are. And we can't go back to pre-Columbian times. It's just not going to happen. We tried extermination. You know, when the Varroa mite first came to New Mexico, it came late to New Mexico because New Mexico is kind of a backwater where there isn't a lot of people move bees into New Mexico for any reason. It's a desert, not known for big honey production. And my old boss with 4,000 hives, when I was honeybee inspector, said, we need to hold the line, and if we see any Varroa mites in New Mexico, we need to exterminate. We need to keep the barn door closed around New Mexico. And I thought, well, that's not going to work. Nobody's ever managed to make that work. We'll see if the Australians, they're really trying hard, and it's costing a lot. And I hope for their sake it works for a while, but it gets to be pretty inevitable. Now, in New Mexico's case, we found Varroa mites in his hives first, and then he suddenly said, oh, no, come to think of it, medication, as he called it, which in those days was apistan fluvalinate. But anyway, so that's a dilemma. Another problem we have in the Americas is, how did the bees get here in the first place? And this is how they got here. They came on ships, and those ships had precious little cargo space. They were little tiny ships. Both the English and the Spanish brought honeybee colonies across the ocean on sailing ships. And they also brought other animals and some feed for the animals and all the things they thought they might need to upset their life in Europe and come and live in the Americas, which means that there was very little space, especially for a bunch of stinging insects. You can imagine, and it's a 6-week journey on the sea. So they didn't bring thousands of colonies. They brought tens of colonies. And the problem with that is that's a genetic bottleneck. That means that the colonies got started with relatively few of the genes available in either England or Spain. So, and both English and Spanish brought honeybees. The Spanish people, the priests brought them because they needed them. They needed beeswax to make candles to be able to say the Mass. You can't say a Catholic Mass without a beeswax candle, at least 51% beeswax, still today. And back those days, they would either get them shipped via the boat, or they would bring some bees over and try to get bees going here. And some of both happened. Another genetic bottleneck is the industrialization of queen rearing. And that means that somebody like Glen Apiaries in California goes through artificial insemination and other means to generate queen mothers that then become the parents of thousands of queens. And that's another form of a genetic bottleneck. What that does is that greatly decreases the genetic diversity of bees in the Americas. Now, during the late 1800s, we did import a fair number of bees. We brought in the Italian bees. We kind of went through an importation flurry. Even USDA back in 1940s brought in bees from Southern Africa, for instance, Apis scutellata, the so-called Africanized or killer bee or whatever. They determined that those, I have granddaughters. If it gets too bad, I can go into a closet. They make a lot of noise. They're 10 months old, one of them, so you can't reason with her. You just have to hide from her.
You're fine, Les.
Okay, good. But they brought in Apis scutellata and they found that that bee had some deficits. It was very prone to sting. It was very prone to abscond. And it suffered from what they call disappearing disease at the onset of winter. When there were no flowers, instead of hunkering down for the winter, they would just abscond to go look for flowers somewhere else, which apparently in South Central Africa, that would make sense. But in the land with the winter, it didn't make sense and they died out. So we went through somewhat of a, influx of genes, but we still have very low genetic diversity. And there's a study there that you can look up if you take a picture of this or get a copy of it. But this has long been known that we have a relatively low genetic diversity in America. And the importance of honeybees in America is, there's another thing that's very crucial that we need honeybees for, and that is we brought over fruit trees. Fruit trees are large flowering trees. Now, can you imagine a honeybee in a beehive? Let's say that somehow she didn't get any pollen from her sisters on her fur while she's in the beehive, and she's being recruited to go and harvest nectar and pollen from flowers for the first time. She goes to the dance floor. She feels the dance. She doesn't see it. She doesn't watch it because it's dark, but she feels it through the vibrations in her feet. And she knows that so many degrees from the sun, so far in bee miles or whatever, there is something that smells like what everybody is smelling in the beehive. And it tastes like this, and everybody gets a little taste, but they've all been tasting it through the trophylactic exchange. There's thousands of blossoms, and it's beautiful, and you should go find them. And she gets all excited, and she goes the right direction, the right bee miles away, and she starts to see these beautiful trees full of waving little flags of pretty flowers, wafting their scent to attract her. It's the scent she's been looking for. She dives into bee heaven. Now, she doesn't go from the pollinating tree back to the tree she needs to pollinate, back to the pollinating tree. She doesn't do that. She goes from flower to flower to flower and fills up with pollen and nectar. She gets covered in the pollen. She rakes it onto her back legs on the corbicula, the little pollen basket, so-called, and makes little pellets. And she just gathers and gathers until she's literally full up and drunk with nectar and pollen. Then she rakes herself one last time, pats the pollen on her back legs. She still has tens of thousands of pollen stuck in her fur on her body. But most of the pollen is collected on her back legs. She flies back to her hive. She dives into the beehive. So do all of her sisters that are visiting all of the trees for 2 to 5 miles in all directions. So pretty soon they're all doing this. They're rubbing together their bodies, right? And they're stirring and churning that pollen until in a very short amount of time, all the bees in the hive have a little bit of all the pollen for miles around. Now she unloads her nectar, she unloads her pollen, she might go listen on the dance floor a little bit, and then she takes off back to her tree. Now she's visiting her tree. She may visit that tree her whole pollinating life because tree's going to bloom for a couple of weeks, and that's about all she's got in her pollinating life. So she may never even go to a different tree, or she might go to a couple of different trees. But she doesn't need to go to a different tree because half of the work of pollination with honeybees occurs in the beehive, where the bees rub together and stir and churn the pollen and then go back out as vectors, taking it to their trees. And I wanted to point one other thing out real quickly that's ideal about this picture on the right with the orchard in full bloom with the dandelions in full bloom. Almond orchardists pay, of course, quite a pretty penny to get almond pollination. And there was a time when they said, well, we ain't paying the bees to pollinate dandelions. So they go in there and rake or kill the dandelions because they wanted the bees to concentrate on the almonds. Then pollination biologists got to studying the situation. They realized bees actually pollinate the almonds better when there are wildflowers in bloom in and around the orchard. And the reasoning might be fairly simple. I like a little bit of chocolate cake once in a while. I do. If I get chocolate cake for lunch, okay, it's a treat. If I get chocolate cake again for dinner, okay. If I get chocolate cake next morning for breakfast, you know what? I need something else. And what they find is that bees pollinate the almonds better when they could get something else, some other pollen to fill out their nutritional needs. And then they'd go back to the almonds and hit the almonds even better when there were other flowers. And I point this out mainly because I want to show that nature isn't always as competitive as we think. Nature is often very, very cooperative. And the flowers are actually cooperating by blooming at different times to get the bees to specialize in their pollen at that time of the day, and then go to the almonds and pollinate the almonds. And honeybees are still quintessential pollinators, particularly of large flowering trees. Bumblebees do fine on dandelions because they go from one plant to the other, to the other, to the other. But when a bee can load up on all the flowers on one tree, she's not going to go from tree to tree to tree to tree. And so we need honeybees. Now, honeybees are native to Africa, Asia, and Europe, and there's really no real Eurasia, you might say. There's no real dividing Europe and Asia. And these bees show differences in traits that make them more adaptable to the areas they're living in. You know, Apis mellifera mellifera would be like the English and the Northern European honeybee. Apis iberica is very closely related, but it's the Spanish, Portuguese honeybee, the Italian honeybee, like Lingustica, all these different so-called races. But the problem is that even in their homelands, like the British are trying to keep or refine the Apis mellifera, the British honeybee, because what has happened is people like Brother Adam, who did a great job of breeding the buckfast bee, would go out and get queen bees from Africa and other parts of Europe and the Middle East and breed them in England, and that, you might say, contaminated pure English bees. So it's hard to find pure English bees even in England. And the pure carniolans, you know, there's been so much inbreeding and interbreeding and mixing and matching by humans that it's hard to find that. And so what do you get? Where do you get it? Now, when people go to these places and measure genetic diversity, the genetic diversity in the honeybees of Africa and Asia and Europe is much higher than it is in the United States. Why do we need genetic diversity? Because with diversity, when the climate changes and these bees do better, well, we have them. We can shift that direction. When climate shifts and these bees do better, well, good. We got all the bases covered. But when you only have one type of honeybee, climate shifts too much, or the blooms shift, there's nothing to reach over there. They just don't make it. Genetic diversity is especially important when times are changing, and times are changing. They always have been, but they're really changing pretty fast now. I have stories of old friends that kept bees in the New Mexico in the 1940s, and they used to make tons of honey. They used to keep 100 beehives in one bee yard and just made honey all spring and summer. And then that started getting less and less. And now you shouldn't keep 100 beehives there because it's way too many beehives for that same area. Things have changed a lot. Then we all see these charts, and they're interesting and good charts. And they say they have an African and buckfast, all the different breeds. Buckfast not even being its own race. Thing is, there is no genetic definition of race, not in people either, by the way. National Geographic tried to categorize people by race, and he decided race in humans is not genetically identifiable. It is a cultural designation, not a biological designation. But at any rate, we see these charts and they kind of can make sense. And you can look through these charts and decide, well, I don't like the African because they're not common and they're very defensive and or whatever. But I love, by the way, the Africanized honeybee here in Texas. They do wonderful, and I work them barehanded in a cotton shirt, not a tee. I don't always wear long sleeves. But I think I'm going to try to show you some videos of me working through a hive real quick here. The problem with this chart is that you can see the different colors and the propensities. Well, the problem is this. I have an unnamed friend. I'm going to call this friend it, not give their gender away, who worked for a large queen breeding company that raised thousands of queens. And when it first started getting ready to cage queens to fill orders, it was given a whole bunch of cages and said, we need so many Italians and so many Carniolans. And it asked, where are the Italians and where are the Carniolans? And the management said, no, it doesn't, they're all the same. If they're dark, they're Carniolans. If they're light, they're Italians. They're kind of in between, they're whatever you need the most of. So it's very difficult to breed pure, well, the granddaughters are really making, okay, well, it's very difficult to breed purity in honeybees in the United States. It's very, very difficult. Bees, but of course we know outcross, they want to breed with many drones from as far away as possible. So it takes a huge amount of effort to try to breed to so-called race or variety. The main thing we have to go on is color. Color can be kind of deceiving because a queen can have a very light color but have recessive dark genes. So she mates with dark and light drones. Her progeny is going to be dark and light. But you know, I like breeding for the dark bees. I think it's interesting to see the black honeybees. So you might say, well, then it doesn't make any difference. Any bees they're all mixed up. It does make a difference. Tom Seeley many years ago wrote Honeybee Ecology, where he studied, one of the things in this book was the propensity to swarm between tropical and temperate bees. If you live in the tropics and the flowers kind of get slim or the flowers get really good, you can decide to cast a swarm. And the ability of the swarm to survive is pretty high because they never have have to worry about winter. They have to make enough honey to survive and ideally build some comb so the queen can raise some brood, but they don't need much. And there's always a little something blooming. Like in Jamaica, there's always, even in the dead of winter, there's a little few trees blooming here and there, or little bushes. So you don't have winter to deal with. So swarming is cheap, it's easy. In the cold winter, to decide to split the hive and go and send the mom off with a whole bunch of bees is very dangerous because it takes a lot of effort to get ready for next winter. Bees are constantly getting ready for next winter, and the propensity to abscond or swarm has to be very low. You have to really think it through and make sure, yeah, the days are getting longer. There's tons of nectar coming in. The swarm would probably make it. So let's go ahead and swarm. And so the swarm takes off, still makes plenty of honey, builds comb, builds up enough honey that it can survive the all too quickly coming long, hard winter. And that's why swarming in temperate climate is more dangerous than swarming in tropical climate. So honeybees have locally adaptive traits, and we have to sift through all the bees that we've imported in the Americas to try to find the traits that make the most amount of sense in our particular climate. And our particular climate is pretty varied. I have friends who keep bees in Phoenix, urban beekeepers in Phoenix, Arizona. Their big honey flow comes in December and January with a citrus bloom, and their big dearth is June, July, and August with a hot, dry dearth. No winter whatsoever, and a dearth in the summer. Here in Austin area, we kind of have two dearths. We get a slight winter dearth, and we get sometimes a pretty fierce June, July, and August summer dearth, where it gets really hot and there's just almost no flowers whatsoever. So every place is different, and you've got to find bees that do well in your climate. And then there's our friend here that I remember keeping bees without for many years. I kept bees for 25 or so years without Varroa mites. And I remember the first time the mites came, and it's never been as easy as it used to be. They do a lot of damage, but here they are. And there's no exterminating them, there's no getting rid of them. We have to learn to live with Varroa mites. But they have to be figured into what you're going to get for your bees. And so when back in I guess it was the early 90s, Tom Rinder wanted to try breeding, going to Russia, southeastern Russia, where Apis mellifera was bordering on it with Apis cerana and was exposed to Varroa mites for potentially thousands of years. He wanted to see if there were indeed Varroa-resistant Apis mellifera in southeastern Russia. That was not an easy trip in those days. This is not an area with high tourist traffic. It was hard to get to. It was often the area where nobody goes. You had military transports and things to even get there back in the early 90s. But what he found was that indeed these bees were Varroa mite resistant. And he showed that they were groomers. We can see in the picture here, there's some intact mites, but there's some mites that are missing pieces of their legs or their underside plate. And a mite bleeds out pretty quickly if you chop off its leg. It doesn't have much protoplasm, much blood, if you will. Anyway, so it doesn't take much damage to the mite's body to cause that mite to die. So these are dead mites on the bottom of the hive. And what we have found here is that between grooming, VSH, and then the propensity of bees to do brood breaks. And this is where I really like our local subtropical bees that have some African genes that are really good for us here because we are in a subtropical climate. As soon as the flowers quit, they break the brood. Any of the mites that are in the brood come out with the emerging brood, there isn't any new brood to go back into. So the mites are forced out on the adult bees where they get groomed off. And so between these various traits, there is mite resistance. I'm going to throw in one more thing, and that is that the mites are breeding, we're left on their own. The mites are breeding they're breeding tolerance to Apis mellifera. What I mean by that is, when the mites first came, they overran Apis mellifera and just killed their host, and then they died. A parasite that kills its host is a dumb parasite. The mice that reproduce more slowly managed to not kill their host, and they left alone, they would be the ones that would survive better. They were more fit because they didn't kill their host. And so what I maintain is that with the use of miticides, we're actually saving more virulent mites from themselves. If we let it go, they would kill their host and kill themselves, and they'd die. And we've shown that in Cuba, for instance, where they didn't use miticides, the mites are reproducing at a much lower rate because the mites that over-reproduced killed themselves when they killed their parent colony. So enough of that. This is not about mites. Susan Colby recognized genetic diversity was low many years ago, and she's started a project where she goes all over the world, and she's importing bees, not importing live bees, because that's a huge project. Took Tom Rinder years to get them on quarantine and then brought into Baton Rouge, going through all kinds of paperwork, Animal Health Inspection Service, USDA. It was a huge headache. But you can import frozen semen from drones much more easily. So that's what she's doing, and she's bringing in semen from all over the world, artificially inseminating queens, and then just using those queens to raise new daughter queens that are more genetically diverse, bringing in genes from Turkey, from all over Europe, Eastern Europe, and trying to bring in ideal, nice bees, good bees that are good for our genetic diversity in the United States. I think that's a pretty good project because, excuse me, we need more genetic diversity all the time. The other thing I tell people all the time is that, there was a time when people got into beekeeping because they wanted to help save the bees. Honeybees have a carrying capacity in any given area. I used to do bee removals in the little city of Santa Fe, New Mexico. And back in the 80s, maybe even late 70s, there would be quite a few calls, more than I could ever get to every year. Because I did it for free. Nowadays it's become a real business and you got to have infrared cameras. I was just doing it as best I could with a hammer and a ladder. I didn't have a bee vac, but anyway, I did that, and there were always feral bees. Then I started teaching beekeeping in Santa Fe, and more people started keeping bees in their backyards right in town. We even went through a spat where they tried to make it illegal. Somebody complained, and city councilman decided to make a law against keeping bees. New Mexico beekeepers went and fought and said, no, look, it's good for the city. The bees are living in the city anyway, in trees and hollow walls and water meters or whatever. And so we're actually keeping very gentle bees. We're doing a good job. Let us keep bees. They agreed, but we had to keep bees so far from the property line so as not to bother the neighbors. And we came to an agreement. We are allowed to keep bees in Santa Fe, New Mexico. But what happened was that as more and more people were keeping bees in their backyards, some people were keeping 10 hives in their backyards, pushing the limits. The numbers of feral colonies that I was being called to remove dropped off to zero. And I began to realize, I think the beekeepers have reached carrying capacity. And the danger is there, if we exceed carrying capacity, then we become like the invasive species that is becoming a danger to the wild bees, the native bees and wasps of our area. Because if this area that you're living in can feed 5 colonies very nicely, and you start keeping 10 and 15 and 20 colonies, now those bees are competing more fiercely for nectar resources amongst each other. And any nectar source that comes up, they're going to be driven to it. And they might start taking nectar sources from hummingbirds and native bees. So keeping too many bees in a place is a bit of a problem. Tom Seeley liked us to keep all of our beehives about a half a mile apart at least. I can't, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But I fully agree that we have to be careful not to keep too many bees in one place, because we think of it as our wealth, having lots of bees. But that may be silly. We may be stressing the bees out. So we need to watch that carrying capacity. And what really people who want to help the bees, all the bees, the native bees, honeybees, all the bees, what we really need to do is plant a lot of flowers and flowering trees and bushes. The loss of habitat is a much bigger issue than the availability of bees. We can keep breeding bees and hope to breed bees that are mite resistant. I just visited a lady who bought bees from a bee weaver, breeds bees without miticides here in Navasota, Texas. And she's in Texas, and she bought 6 hives from him years ago. I just went and visited her this few days ago. All 6 of her hives are alive and well. And she said, I've never done anything to these bees. I occasionally harvested some honey, but I don't even know how to treat. And I keep feeling guilty. And I said, well, obviously they don't care. They're just living their lives in your boxes. She's got a combination of top bar hives and Langstroths. So we know that bees can survive fine without miticides. And that's true also in New Mexico and California, where I kept bees for a good many years eventually without miticides. That's partly because I did import the Russian honeybee when it first became available back from Tom Rinder's project. So what I like to tell people is, if you're becoming a beekeeper, get some bees that are survivors. I would look locally first. And then we all look at those charts and read about Saskatraz or mite biters or the Russians. The Russians are great bees, and we're going to try some more integration of Russian genetics into what we got. But what we got is really good. We have a sort of a mixed race or variety bunch of bees here with a fair amount of African genes in them that are very tough on the mites, very disease resistant, very good at this sort of tough semi-tropical climate that we have here. And they're great bees. Now, does that mean we don't want to try some other exotic varieties? Not at all. We're going to try some. But here's the way I like to try it. I would order that fancy exotic queen, or 2 or 3 or 10 or however many you have the capacity for. And then put them, you get a hive ready. Now, when I did my first Russians, I was told, oh, they're so genetically distinct, it's hard to get acceptance. So what I did is I made divides in the bee yard, kept the queenless divide with a lot of nurse bees. So I brushed open brood onto capped brood, 4 combs. This was back in my Langstroth days. I was just converting to top bar hives back then. And then, so that means that all the field bees drifted back to the mother colony. The young bees stayed in the new divide. And I introduced a queen to that hive because the young bees are much more accepting of foreign queens, so to speak. And I had very good acceptance. And I quit using miticides on those bees right away. I had been using juniper bark smoke intermittently, and really, oh, that's a whole nother, I could talk for too long, and I'll get off the subject here. But so I got Russian bees started, and I never did treat them, and they survived with some dips, but more and more they survived. And so what I wound up with was the mother that I started the hive with eventually died, and I got daughters, and some of those daughters were mite susceptible, but many of them were mite resistant. And now what I was breeding was an F1. That means I'm breeding the mite resistance of the Russian bees into the locally adapted New Mexican or Texan bees or Minnesota bees or wherever you're from. So you get a hive going right away with your exotic queen and keep it restricted. You might even consider, if you're in a Langstroth situation, one medium depth box, 8 or 10 frame, or a 5 frame nuke if it's deeps. Just keep them in that until you crowd them and they raise queen cells. As soon as they raise queen cells, make a divide. You've got your queen somewhere with a couple of combs of brood and some support, and let the new colony build some queens that are her daughters. They're going to go out and mate with the local drones. And now you're going to have F1s of your exotic queen mixed with the local drones. So they're going to be a mix right away and see what you get. And it's fun. It's fun to raise daughters and breed them to our local bees and see what we get. Now, there was a study done way back in, I believe it was probably in the early 80s, where they went out and they weighed queens from different queen breeders. They found that some queen breeders had real variable weights. Some had smaller, lower weights, and some had higher weights. But none of them added up to the weights of queens raised in natural swarm cells. Natural swarm cells were about 25% heavier than the biggest queens raised by apparently the best queen breeders. So to me, when you let your bees get restricted in space, and you basically, instead of swarm prevention, you're practicing swarm enticement. You're trying to get them to swarm. And then you catch them at this stage, like you can see in this picture where you got those queen cells with full of royal jelly and larvae. Let them get a little bit closer to captain, make your divide. You're basically saying, get ready to swarm, get ready to swarm. Oh, you're ready, let's do it right now. Instead of losing the swarm, you just make a queen right divide. And now you've swarmed them into your box, and you've got a daughter queen coming that is related to your exotic queen, but then can also breed in some local genetics. And if you can do that 3 or 4 times, you're going to have some very interesting daughters to sift through and see how they do. Get them established in some hives, give them a little bit of support so they can build up and overwinter. And you're off on the never-ending dance to keep breeding bees. Really, I don't see the bees. I'm not keeping bees. I like to tell people, the beehive's door is always wide open. We don't keep them. If we were to keep them in the hive, they'd all die. They won't even poop in the hive, right? They have to go out to relieve themselves. We don't keep them. We give them a box and they choose to stay or not. And really, I like to learn to kind of like not keep them, but dance with them. What do you want to do? Try to listen to them as much as do this and do that. Sit quietly, learn to move calmly and slowly. I have that video I wanted to show. Let me see if I can figure that out real quickly. It's right over here. No.
I
don't
can
know.
help you out. If you got the video on your desktop, Les?
Yes.
Okay, so what you're gonna want to do is you're gonna go to your share screen option. There's the green share screen option on your
Right.
on your Zoom control bar, and when you're gonna click that box again, and it's gonna bring up a white window. So you click the share screen again, and it'll bring up the big white window. And there's
Oh, I got it. There you go. Thank you. I bet you've had to do this for a number of beekeepers.
just a couple.
Okay. So this is just a real quick. I had already gone through this. I wanted to point something out. This is a video, but you can see the wax moth cocoons embedded in the side of this top bar hive. What happened was that I had gone through a beehive and realized it had died and was full of wax moths. I cleaned it out rudimentarily and then decided, oh, I'll come back. It's about 2 hours from my home and I was running out of daylight. I'll come back in a few weeks and I'll clean it out real good. When I came back in a few weeks, it was full of bees. Bees had swarmed into it. And they were building perfectly straight combs on this top bar hive all by themselves and cleaning the wax moth webbings out themselves. And so I went ahead and harvested a little bit of honey. And this is me just checking through them in the dead of getting ready for winter and just showing how I take a few minutes to check. And you can see that this is capped honey. So there's about 9 combs. That's all they need to get through the winter in this area near Austin, Texas. Even there's a difference between Austin and San Antonio, Texas, really, in terms of climate a little bit. And this is me with working so-called Africanized or killer bees with bare hands and a cotton shirt, just to have a veil on. And all I care about is, do they have enough honey to get through the winter? That's capped honey. That's heavy, it's full, I'm fine. That one shows holes. Well, I can see a little empty spot off to the right on the bottom of that comb from here. And what's happening is the brood was in there. The brood is hatching out and they're backfilling it with honey. So they're getting ready for winter. They're doing great. Have a little tiny brood nest on the next comb over. It's still down in the beehive there that I haven't lifted yet, which I'm lifting just for the sake of the camera. You can see there's a nice tight brood pattern. They have no problem. They have plenty of honey, have a good queen. I don't need to see the queen. A lot of beginning beekeepers want to find the queen every time. That's totally dangerous, really. I mean, you could damage the queen. I'm done. They're doing great. I tapped the front top bar to make sure it's not empty in case I put an empty one there. But I tapped it and I could tell it didn't sound hollow. So I'm packing them back up and they're ready for winter. And now I'm ready for questions.